This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
I don't think it's hyperbole, right? Like, you can't get a more defamatory thing in modern day media than literally calling someone Hitler. Like, you can't go further than that. Where do they go from here?
Where do they go? Well, I guess technically this article is saying that Adam Bandt is like Hitler.
Oh, I'm so sorry. He's not
next step
actually Hitler.
You say that he is actually Hitler.
Right. He is not Hitler incarnate. Or maybe could be incarnate.
We were going to talk about Phil Curry. Phil Curry was supposed to have the most cooked opinion piece about the Greens in the past week, okay? This
person has said, hold my beer. Whoever this is, Francis Galbally, said, hold my fucking beer.
Never heard of him. You'll be amazed to hear that Francis Galbally is a former lawyer and now a Melbourne-based businessman and investment banker.
What?
Okay. It's so weird that he doesn't like the Greens. But yes, Phil Curry's out there last week. He was doing some bullshit that goes beyond politicking. The Greens have lost their fucking minds. He wrote, rather than a conservation party, it is these days more an anti-capitalist socialist movement, which in recent months, in the wake of the Israel-Gaza conflict, has teetered on the brink of and at times dabbled in Marxism. Now, that was the original quote in the article. People had shitting on that. It's like, what are you talking about?
What does that mean?
Do
you know what that means?
Do you know what it means? The political editor of the AFR, do you have any idea what the fuck this means? Rachel Withers saying, what does Phil Curry think Marxism means? John Puccini saying, once again, I'm begging a journalist to read a book. And then I pulled up that piece to talk about it on the show this week, and he's changed it to Trotskyism. He's changed Marxism to Trotskyism, and there's just no correction or acknowledgement that they fucked it up there whatsoever. Just like, people were mean to me, and I looked it out.
Which my theory is, because haven't we said this on the show before, that like no one knows what Trotskyism is? Like it's a step further. That it's like most people know what Marxism. Well, maybe not most people, but like a lot of people know what Marxism is. But to be able to pin down what you mean when you say Trotskyism is harder. And so by subbing out Marxism by Trotskyism, he's like, well, it could mean anything.
Yeah, people aren't going to go to that Wikipedia article, for God's sakes. I think he just means protests at this point. I think if you're at a protest, you're a trot. That's basically
because that's right. That's what the article is about, right? Is like pro-Palestine protests. Okay.
But then, and this just dropped the morning of our recording in the Australian newspaper, the paper of record, this is the greatest broadsheet this nation has ever produced. A piece by Francis Galbally, who we've never heard of course, but he's an investment banker. These duplicitous modern Greens are wolves in sheep's clothing.
I mean, that sounds like, it already sounds like it's going to be a silly column, but nothing could have prepared me for this, Tom. Nothing.
Australians need to be very careful. The Greens are not what their name implies. Incredible opening sentence there. It rolls
really
off the tongue.
Written. Yeah.
It's really good. Many of us might shrug our shoulders and think little about it, but names and slogans are important. They greatly influence us, often subliminally, and particularly when they relate to political organisations. As Shakespeare's Juliet remarked, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
I mean, isn't that
political
quote...
parties are, however, not sweet.
Okay. Because that quote is about the direct opposite of what you're saying, which is that names are important. That one's like, names actually don't matter. But he just wanted to put the Shakespeare quote in because he's an investment banker. Sorry, writer.
Shakespeare's Juliet is also amazing. So then we have one of the harshest turns I've ever seen in modern political commentary. We've talked about Shakespeare's Juliet. In Germany, the 1920s, a relatively young Adolf Hitler had political ambitions. Then basically goes on to explain that Hitler is a thing and he came up with the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. We know it as a Nazi party. They weren't really socialist. At least he admits the fact that the Nazis weren't actually socialists. I think that's quite good. It was all a sneaky trick to attract the working class in Germany to his fascist cause. Nazi party weren't socialist, yada, yada, yada. And basically they wanted to eliminate all Jews. Australians' Greens look increasingly like the Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party. What?
No. Do they?
The party has a name that attracts young, mobile, and relatively wealthy urban Australians.
Check.
I think Francis thinks that people hear the name of a political party, and that's the amount of research they do. That's pretty much it.
Mm.
These people want to fix the world and believe the only way to do so is through such things as environmental change and carbon reduction. These are good. These are good intentions, but the Greens party of Bob Brown is not the Greens party of Adam Bandt. And I must say that is a common sentiment that's been echoed in the recent commentary about the Greens.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, they're not the party of Bob Brown anymore. But as anyone who's been listening to our series on Inside the Greens will know, that from the outset of the Greens and the political movement, there's always been class politics. There's always been radicals. It's sort of fundamental to the whole. But
also specifically, if your concern is more about the Greens' anti-war pro-peace activism, that's even more that's very fundamental Greens stuff. Come on.
Yes. No, of course that's not what it's about. They're just doing Trotskyism. What's Trotskyism? Anyway, moving on. In my opinion, there appears to be alarming similarities between Adam Bandt's Greens and Hitler's Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party of the 1920s and 1930s. Both leaders are ideologues and demagogues. No, they're not. They are anti-Semitic in their rhetoric.
Oh, yeah. Adam Bandt is really, I can see that the lawyers have been like, oh, maybe put it in my opinion at the start. If you put it in my opinion, I think you should probably put that in. But then they're like, Adam Bandt is kind of like Hitler. You know why? In the anti-Semitism, I'm going to say that's the similarity.
That's the way in which they're similar. They're both quite short as well.
Short, yes, okay.
They're anti-Semitic in their rhetoric. This encourages in many a belief that the Jews are the cause of things wrong with society. I mean, just no examples are cited at any point whatsoever about what this actual anti-Semitism
reference not found. Yeah.
Bandt encourages the chant from the river to the sea. You know what I've noticed too is that people love to leave out the Palestine will be free bit as well when they're talking about the chant.
They really do, yeah.
They're like, oh, don't worry about that bit. It's the geography that's the problem. What does that mean other than the annihilation of the Jewish state and its people? Well, you could fucking talk to anybody or read an article or a book and maybe find out exactly what that means, and rather just assume that what you think it means, that's what it means. Maybe you could read anything at all to find out the truth there. A whole bunch of nonsense again. Bandt's rant a few days ago has the hallmarks of a Nazi rally. I assume this means his response to the insane condemnation in the parliament, slandering the Greens as anti-Semitic.
And it was like a Nazi rally, was it?
That was very much like a Nazi rally. When the member for Melbourne got up in the federal parliament, he accuses the major parties of slandering this movement. He calls on the Israeli ambassador to be expelled. Perfectly reasonable things to do.
Yeah.
He calls on sanctions against Israeli. Incredible work, copy editors.
Good editing, thank you.
He says enough of the hand-wringing tweets, enough of the words that always come with conditions attached. They are being ignored by an extreme war cabinet that is hell-bent on continuing this invasion. Where's the lie, Francis? And like 1930s Munich, police had to move in to quell the violent protesters and use pepper spray. In Munich, it was batons.
It's really starting to see a lot of similarities here. It's actually kind of hard to tell the difference.
I can't tell where Adam Bandt ends and Hitler begins. Both Adam Bandt and Hitler famously both breathe oxygen, I believe. I mean, when will the... Bandt doesn't mention how the Gaza war started, and appears to have no empathy for the abducted Israelis and the rape and killing of women and children. Bandt is a frightening demagogue. He distorts the truth, which suits a political agenda. No examples here again. And of course, the Greens have regularly condemned the attacks on October the 7th. Like Hitler, Bandt uses propaganda, discontent, and fear-mongering to gain support. He finds support among anti-Semites and uses climate action and anti-capitalist rhetoric to feed his supporters. What? What are you saying?
Give me climate action. Anti-capitalist rhetoric.
Watch this little term, which I think is very interesting. Bandt would massively raise taxes and drive business from Australia. What? His rhetoric on tax and anti-business plays to his supporter base, much as Hitler did. And, like Hitler, he gets support from some individuals and businesses.
Whoa. This guy is good at seeing patterns. This is pattern recognition, baby. This guy's IQ is probably really high. Really, really high.
Oh, Francis, come on the pod anytime you like, mate.
Incredible.
Take some time away from investment banking and come chat to Serious Danger. Hey, Hitler was the serious danger as well.
The most destructive political force in the country, the Greens.
They are the most destructive force in Australian politics.
They are not a force for good.
We're stuck with the hosts of Chapo Shithouse podcast.
Serious danger to Australia.
Hey, this is Serious Danger, a podcast about green politics in Australia, not an official Greens Party podcast because we don't want to associate ourselves with Hitler. That's right, we condemn Hitler and we're not afraid to say it. This podcast is made possible with the help of the Green Institute and produced by Michael the Griffin. This week we have a guest. You excited, Tom?
I'm very excited. It is the recently elected leader of the Victorian Greens, the member for the state seat of Melbourne, Ellen Sandell, is going to be on the show. We're going to be chatting about the state of Victorian politics, how she's finding the new gig as leader. We'll chat many things with Ellen very shortly. Big thanks to our new patrons, Kwame, Lupin, Kitty, and Tristan. Thank you very much for chipping in just $3 a month, or maybe more if you're very generous,
maybe more,
to support us here at Serious Danger Industries. This week we released a Patreon episode. Oh boy.
This was a good one. It's sad for you.
One.
Sad for you, though. I don't know why you're smiling, because this is about comedy in crisis, how cancel culture is killing laughter. The Sky News original, a documentary. That's right. We did a documentary because we're quite intellectual.
We're very smart, and you had to be to keep up with the kind of arguments that were being run here about how telling jokes is a crime now, and cancel culture is both killing society, but is also not a big deal actually because Ricky Gervais is doing fine, and so fuck you.
Yeah, Ricky Gervais is pretty funny. You should listen to it. It's very good. Tom, I do have an apology to make though before we go any further. Actually, I have two apologies.
Yes.
First of all, I have to apologize to my mother for a couple of podcasts ago implying that she may have inadvertently, say, let her membership lapse, or that she maybe unsubscribed from the Patreon and then resubscribed. It was not her. She advised me that the new Merrin who'd signed on as a Patreon subscriber was not, in fact, her. And so my second apology is to the real Merrin, who wrote in to say, "Hi, Emerald and Tom. I'm definitely not Emerald's mum, but weirdly enough, I do live in the town of Emerald, Victoria." Whoa. She said, "I'm the convener of the Dandenong Rangers Greens branch and just going through pre-selection to be the candidate for the federal seat of Casey. I love the show, and if you are keen to have candidates on the show, keep me in mind. The Merrin/Emerald thing is the start of a good story. Cheers, Merrin." I'm very sorry to both Merrins.
All right, Emerald? Your mum's not the only fucking Merrin.
Yeah. There's not that many with it spelt that way, so, to be fair. But I guess our reach, our audience is so broad, I shouldn't have assumed.
We're massive, man. We've also had a few messages. Thank you very much for people, particularly on last week's episode. Last week was, pretty bleak week for a bunch of reasons. I mean, it became funny because of how ridiculous it got, but people seem to get a lot out of our chat with Campbell Gome from the Jewish Greens. Elle says, "Didn't anticipate I'd be crying listening to a podcast today, but here we are. Big thank you for this discussion. So grateful to Campbell for sharing his thoughts." Very much echo that. Thank you, Elle, and thank you again for Campbell for joining us on the show last week. And PC Thug.
She called me a PC thug.
Well, I've been called a greasy thug too, and it never stops hurting.
Sent us a message saying, "I hope everyone has read the Asa Winstanley book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism. These attacks on the Greens are so boringly predictable, but we need to learn from the lessons and mistakes of Corbyn." I think that's probably a pretty good point. I mean, again, that opinion piece that we read at the start is so ridiculous and funny to us, but I mean, use very similar tenor of the debate in the attacks that were wheeled out against Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party, and I think you would say worked in that particular case in terms of completely kneecapping that movement. So it is something to be taken seriously, both the scourge of anti-Semitism itself and these bad faith accusations that are wheeled out and weaponized against anyone who dares speak up for Palestine. So I haven't heard of that book, but thanks very much for the suggestion, PC Thug.
Well, if you look at the United States, the United Kingdom, they're not meeting their targets. So what's happening in that scenario? The government here is not going to meet its target. What tariffs will be applied to them? I think they're reasonable questions to ask, but we've got a responsible pathway to meet our net zero by 2050 obligation, but we can't destroy the economy in the process. People are not going out to restaurants. People are spending less when they do go out, and that is as a result of inflation, which is high, it's sticky, and in part it's because of the Prime Minister's renewables-only energy policy.
I feel like a caricature of winter now.
Is it? Yeah. How cold? What's the weather in Brisbane? Let me look.
Well, it's not that cold today. I will be like, it was pretty cold last week. What is it right now?
It's 17 degrees. You fucking freaks.
It feels kind of cold though.
We're going to top a 13 here.
Jesus,
Currently
fuck.
8.
How do you live there? All right. Well, there's some good news on the way. Should we talk about climate change?
Please. Please. It's cold now, so actually I think climate change would be good.
Yeah. I wouldn't have to be wearing this scarf if the fucking Liberals were in power. So, come on, election. Let's go, baby. Look, okay, story this week, very briefly, let's get into it. Peter Dutton, leader of the Liberal National Coalition in the federal parliament, told the Weekend Australian last weekend that the LNP would ditch the current government's climate emissions reduction targets if they won the next election. To refresh everyone's memory, those targets that passed the House, last year or was it 2022? Maybe it was 2022, were for a 43% cut on 2005 levels of emissions domestically. Peter Dutton says, quote, "There's no sense in signing up to targets you don't have any prospect of achieving." So the angle is we're not going to meet them and so we would ditch them. But that kind of contradicts government modelling, which was released last year and projected a 42% cut by 2030. So almost 43 based on existing policies and projects. Now, that's just a projection. Like, that relies on everything rolling out as planned. But even so, I feel like that angle of we're not going to meet 43 is a silly one. So why are they actually doing this? What is the angle here?
Well, I mean, yes, they're trying to build political capital by putting a choice. They want to have another climate election, basically, it seems, which we can discuss how insane that is, seeing as you would argue
for
they
them
lost the last one really bad. I've seen some commentary saying, yes, Dutton is really trying to take this. He's saying the teal seats are gone. We're not winning them back. Let's just go for the suburbs. Let's focus on cost of living. Let's focus on energy prices. But
that's not making it a climate election. To be clear, that's kind of the opposite, right?
Well, if you can capitalize and again pump up the idea that I'm pretty sure most Australians have moved on from, the idea that renewables are unreliable and more expensive when it comes to your energy prices. If you can play into that argument, which will be happily backed up by the Murdoch media pretty easily, I don't know, that is one potential option that they might be going for, I suppose.
Well, you'd be surprised. I mean, the depressing thing is I was reading an article that has some polling by Redbridge recently about energy and climate and what people are concerned about. And I mean, the main thing that comes out of this polling by Redbridge is that people are more concerned about cost of living than they are about rising emissions, which I think is unsurprising. Like, that doesn't really surprise me too much. Yes. But one of the things in that poll, for example, is that 61% of respondents said a shift to cleaner energy would increase their bills. So
most people think that, yes.
Yes. So actually maybe most people haven't moved on from that idea, and that's
that is depressing. Very annoying.
Yeah, and the LNP is no doubt capitalizing on that. And that is wild, right? Like, I thought that was debunked as well.
Well, also, is there also a grim reality in that we haven't had a major climate disaster for a little while? I know that's a fucked up thing to say or think, but I think it's certainly true. At least my memory of the peak of concern when you saw like widespread polling showing just how worried people were about climate change was, of course, in the wake of the 2020 bushfires or the floods, the recent floods as well. I mean, I think that is what brings it front of mind for a lot of people. And fortunately, obviously, we haven't had a major one of those that's grabbed national attention in the same way that others have recently. So it's good that it hasn't happened. But I suppose in terms of the climate debate, and when the cost of living crisis gets so bad, that's where people's focus goes to, I guess. Yeah.
Well, and it's probably also, I mean, I would say a lot of people are looking at their power bills going up, and people have an idea that the proportion of renewable energy in our mix is increasing. There's a correlation versus causation thing that, particularly conservatives are trying to exploit, like in Queensland Parliament this week, for example. And I want to get back into the coalition's response to this in a second, but the Catters were moving this motion about scrapping climate targets and saying, well, look at it, power bills have gone up and up as we're building more renewables. Like, you don't have to be a genius to look at that and figure out what's happening. Like, you've got to be realistic. And I mean, we know that that's not true. We know that there's evidence like clearly debunking that. But it's not crazy that people would look for something to blame, particularly because they're not given any permission to blame the real cause, which is price gouging, corporations and the privatization of many parts of our energy system. Instead, like governments don't want to provide that explanation. So it being renewables' fault, it's unsurprising that people believe that.
Right. Remind me, the coalition went to 2022 with a 28% target, right? By 2030.
26 to 28 was
26 to 28, which is what the
Yeah.
original Paris Agreement outlined for, right? And then Labor said, no, we're going to 43. And of course, the Greens, in line with the science, was talking about a 75% reduction, right? Yeah,
well, but it's also misleading to say that either of the major parties' policies were aligned with the Paris Agreement. Like, this is a thing that is always it very much relies on how someone's spinning it, because the Paris Agreement is about limiting warming to a particular level. Like, so
Right.
the targets are open to interpretation in some ways. And what I mean by that is, like, what we signed on to in 2005 at the Paris Conference of Parties on climate change was that we agree to make efforts to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally below 1.5 degrees. Like, we do everything we can to keep it 1.5 degrees above, or less than that, above pre-industrial levels. And then when you come to targets, like, for example, at the end of last year, there was a reiteration, like a reassessment of what kind of targets would be required. And they say, sure, global emissions would need to fall by 43% by 2030 in order to meet that, like, to be compliant with those temperature targets. But first of all, that's on a 2019 baseline, and Australia uses the 2005 baseline. So if we were going to convert that, for example, we should actually be going for like a 56% cut by 2030. But
And
also,
so do we use 2005 because that was like a really low year for emissions or some
I don't
bullshit?
know, actually.
I think I remember reading somewhere that it's like, again, just another very cheeky thing. Like, yeah, 2005. That's the year we should go by.
Yeah.
Which for some reason was a particularly low year. But anyway.
Yeah, good question. No, I actually don't know.
Mm.
But yeah, so there's like the year. And then there is the bigger question of what is Australia's responsibility in, like, and how much weight do we need to shoulder in meeting global emissions reduction targets when we're talking about global warming, because the Paris Agreement says that wealthier countries and high emissions countries should do more, and that's Australia. And so we shouldn't be doing, like, if the global target, even if it were 43%, but if it's 56%, we need to be doing more than that to pull our weight, which is why groups like the Greens say that it should be, what is it, 75% by 2030. Yeah, and net zero by 2035, because we're wealthy and high emitting country. So no,
and
neither
all of these targets and stuff does not include scope 3 emissions. Is that
exactly
right? Like the amount of emissions that we export. Okay, fantastic.
No,
great.
That's right. Doesn't include exports. We're even just talking about domestic emissions, things that we can, the carbon that's burnt and released into the atmosphere within the Australian borders that don't go up to the atmosphere. But no, so neither party has a position that's consistent with Paris, like, to be very clear. But obviously Peter Dutton is even more blatantly violating the terms of the Paris Agreement if he pulled us backwards on our targets, because in the agreement it, like, quite explicitly prohibits countries from reducing their targets after they've already been set on from backsliding, basically. So even if you don't, like, you're not breaching the agreement necessarily if you don't meet targets that you'd set. Like, it's like, do your best, but if you fall short, you're not booted off the agreement. But if you backslide, like, that is prohibited.
Gotcha.
Yes.
And he doesn't care about Paris because he's focused on serving Australians.
That's right.
Anthony Albanese can look after the people in Paris. It was just an agreement in Paris, you fucking idiot. Yeah. Everyone was there.
Yeah, no. I mean, I agree. Fuck the French, but, like,
particularly if they elect
Parisians,
fucking a million far right people into their parliament, the snap election. What the hell is going on there? Yeah,
whatever the fuck is going on. No, Peter Dutton said, so at a press conference in Sydney, he said, quote, "When we're not going to do things that hurt Australians, the Labor Party can try and please people in Paris. My job is to take care of the Australian people."
Got him.
I like a lot of people
there's
like
nothing more un-Australian than France, to be fair.
than French. Well,
Yeah.
so true. I mean, someone should tell that to both major parties and their military deals. I mean, a lot of people are pointing out, like, does he understand that the Paris Agreement is not an agreement like with Paris? It's not specifically related to Paris. It's just that that's where the meeting was, where all the countries agreed to this. I don't think that he doesn't get that, to be honest. I actually think this is maybe not as dumb as we would like to think it is, because it's more about the idea of a group of elites meeting somewhere far from where you live, making decisions about your life that are then affecting your everyday, your finances and your life and your security. And so I think actually it's not an unwise way to characterize something like the Paris Agreement to make it seem, like this like distant meeting of elites, right? If you're trying to tie that to power bills in particular, which is obviously what they're trying to do.
I guess so. It's still dumb in the proper way.
Oh, it
There
is
might
dumb.
be some kind of smart appealing to the base instincts of disengaged Australians, but it's still objectively dumb.
Yeah. Well, what about the second part of this, which is the coalition saying that they're not even going to give us a plan. They're not going to set any alternative targets before the election. Initially, David Coleman, like Liberal frontbencher David Coleman, was saying, yep, we'll make all of our targets very clear prior to the election. But then a couple of days later, Peter Dutton came in, overruled that, said there would be no interim targets. By interim, they mean before 2050, before the next election. So they're to be clear, they're saying, look, we're still committed to net zero by 2050, but in terms of what happens in between now and then, quote, we'll make those decisions when we're in government.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, pretty amazing. And that was the headline. Like, Peter Dutton will not tell you until after the election. Will not tell you these targets until after the election. That's what people went with. I think his argument is that they need the resources of government to make those kind of decisions, which is just infuriating. I mean, it's like...
I mean, there are a lot of people who've done this work for you, by the way. Like,
yes.
But you don't want to listen to them.
No, exactly. And you can draw on the resources, as the leader of the opposition, you have heaps of resources to research policies. You can get things costed. You can put things through the resources of the parliament. And your job is to provide an alternative. And to say that, you're not even going to do it until after you're elected is fucking bonkers. And to have no interim target between now and 2050, again, just illustrates how much of a bullshit fantasy net zero by 2050 is. It's an excuse for the politicians in the here and now to defer and delay and distract you from the action that is desperately needed to arrest the climate crisis.
Yes.
So I guess it's honest in that way, I suppose. At least he's sort of saying, look, we think these interim targets are bullshit because we want to hang on to the fantasy of net zero by 2050. Thanks.
That's all we've got. Yeah. I mean, and just finally on this story, because it seems clear what angle Dutton and his backers are taking on this, that they're saying, yes, climate action is a threat to cost of living, and cost of living is what people care about. And so that's what we're focusing on. But I'm curious to know whether there is this kind of split in the coalition on this. Obviously, that's been an issue before. There's maybe, a quote unquote schism between rural or regional nationals or even Liberal MPs and the more moderate city dwelling Liberal colleagues, as the media might refer to them. So Bridget Archer apparently called the scrapping of the targets, quote, a regressive step that should be put to the voters before the election, like as in they should commit to the targets before the election. Interestingly, a little bit of Queensland insight this week, that CATA motion that I was talking about that they put up to scrap Queensland's climate targets, which are quite relatively ambitious. The Labor government adopted these earlier this year, 75% cut in emissions by 2035. And the LNP supported that. They supported really strong climate targets. But now it's clear that the LNP are kind of confused about this, or, there's rumblings or uncertainty among Liberal and National MPs on how to approach this. Some of them are like, let's build nuclear, like Dutton is saying. They've said they're going to drop major energy storage projects like this big pumped hydro project that's kind of the centerpiece of the Labor Party's energy and jobs plan, their climate transition plan. But at the same time, when this motion comes up, and this is very rare, this doesn't normally happen in Queensland Parliament, when the vote happens, they all disappeared. They literally, like, all the MPs just were, they were busy. I don't know. They just weren't in the chamber for some reason to vote on this. Like, they don't want to say that they're abstaining, but they are clearly wedged on this issue, in Queensland at least.
Yeah, and I think that's replicated at the federal level. Again, I mean, for your Tim Wilsons, for any of the Liberal candidates that are trying to win back seats that were lost to the Teals, this stuff is no good. And apparently they were taken by surprise, and this was sort of Dutton going out rogue on his own, apparently sort of making this call. And if he is seriously saying, yeah, fuck all those seats that we lost, we're not going to win them back, let's just focus on the suburbs and try and, hit cost of living as hard as possible and try and key into this perception that renewables are more expensive and that the priority should be, making sure people aren't drowning in debt and bills, let's go for it. I mean, it's probably fine for Dutton in Dixon, but I don't think, any Liberal candidates trying to win back Till seats are going to have a great time there.
Yes.
I think you would say the coalition's probably said, look, we're not going to beat Labor on climate policy, right? Like,
true, wise. Labor
Right.
could take a leaf out of that book and stop trying to beat the LNP on their strong, on their points.
Yes. So the bet is, can we minimize this as an issue, as it won't be front of mind for voters going to the election, and can we try and attack them on other fronts?
Yeah. And sadly, I think it is kind of in the zeitgeist, and I hope that it returns to front of mind because it's the, greatest existential threat to fucking humanity and life as we know it. But hey, we'll see.
I don't know. Hitler was a vegetarian, it all sounds pretty.
30% of Victorians rent. Millennials and Gen Z are becoming a bigger voting bloc than any other generation, and they will not stand by as governments who have so severely screwed them over continue to do nothing about the rental crisis. The rent is too damn high, so why won't Labor actually do something about it?
All right, the Victorian Greens have a new leader, everyone. Back in April, former leader Samantha Ratnam announced she would be stepping down to contest the seat of Wills to put Peter Khalil onto JobSeeker. The 8 Vic Greens MPs met to elect a new member, and that is our guest for this week. She has been the state member for the state of Melbourne since 2014. She was the former deputy leader of the Vic Greens. She's just 39 years old. She is a general legend. Ellen Sandell, welcome to Serious Danger.
Thanks for having me. Exciting to be here.
Hey, congrats on getting the job. You've been in there for 2 months now. How is it going?
Well, it's exciting. I just think we're in such an exciting period for the Victorian Greens. People around the country might not know, but we've got balance of power in the upper house in Victoria, so wielding a bit of power to try and get some of the things that we want. And we've just got such a good team of MPs, but also all the volunteers, members, organisers right across the state, just getting out there and talking to voters about winning some stuff. It's great. And it was, we're just at this really pivotal moment in politics, I think, with the crises that are happening. Like, we've got climate change, which is why I came to politics, housing, the war in Gaza, everything that's happening around the world, all the crises that seem to be converging because of the broken political system that we have. And it's this really unique political moment. And for us, that means we need to win more seats now to exert that political power to get change. And we needed to make sure that Samantha could go and do that to win Wills, which meant that I needed to step up into the leadership role to do that. And I just think I was happy to do it because I think at this point in time, we actually all just need to do absolutely everything that we possibly can. And I was happy to do this to play my part in the broader movement. Yeah, in the spirit of just doing absolutely everything we can to win some stuff and to get change.
We love to win. That's great. Can you give us an insight into the leadership process? I assume there's a lot of brutal backstabbing, there's a lot of numbers counting, a lot of betrayals.
All my kitchen knives are
trading. Yeah.
blunt now. No, it's actually really nice. I think that Labor actually, they just don't understand that we do things differently. It's quite funny and interesting because when you go out to a press conference, the journos have all been worded up by Labor to ask these questions like, was there all this backstabbing and what was the process like and who put their hand up? It's like, actually, we do things differently. We literally sit in a room,
everyone
all
sat
8 of us,
together with tea and was like, no, you do it. You do
There
it.
you go. I couldn't possibly. Me, little old me, get out of here.
I know. And so we literally just all sat around and discussed it and talked about all the different options and the combinations and who was needed for which jobs. And This is ultimately the way it came out, but everyone was just willing to step up to make sure that Samantha could go on to win Wills, because ultimately we're all here to get change, right? I came to politics as a climate activist. I want to get action on climate change. I want to get action on housing. I want to stop the war. And in order to do that, we just have to exert political power and win Wills and win more seats, because that's the only language that the government seems to understand. And so we're all willing to play our part in that.
I want to get onto those big issues and policy and stuff in a moment, but I should just ask, I mean, we've got the co-deputy leaders, Sam Hibbins and Sarah Mansfield, who are stepping into those roles under your leadership. Look, this is generally not any kind of gotcha. I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts here. Emerald and I have talked a lot about the show, about the fact that we think that, ideally members would be electing the leaders of the Greens parties at the state and federal level. I don't know. Do you care weighing into that? Your thoughts and feelings about that whole...
Sure. And look, I think that's a really valid viewpoint, and I'm really supportive of the party having that conversation. Ultimately, we have to make decisions based on the rules that we have. And the Victorian Party a few years ago had a discussion about it. They decided not to change the rules. And so we had to make the decision based on the rules that we had. But the party wants to have that conversation about members electing leaders. I think that's a really healthy thing in a democracy and in a strong grassroots party, and we should have that conversation for sure.
What's the Queensland deal again, Emerald? You guys don't have leaders at the state level, right?
We don't, because we've only got 2 MPs.
You got 2 MPs.
So if we elect another MP next election, I think 3 is the threshold, and then it would be 1 member, 1 vote. Members would decide who the leader is. Yeah.
Okay. And just finally, a little bit of admin business. So what is the process for electing someone to replace Sam Ratnam? She's still in the upper house. She's still the upper house MP at the moment, but there is a process to figure out who takes over that seat. What's the update there?
That's right. So my understanding is the party hasn't opened that process yet, but it will soon, and it'll be a general call for nominations for that Northern Metro seat, and then all the members in Northern Metro region will get to vote for who their next MP will be, and I'm super excited to see who it will be. I think we've got some really amazing members in that area. I mean, just look at the strength of all the door knocks that are happening every weekend in Wills during the week, all our amazing councillors. I think we've just got some incredible talent there. So I'm really excited to see who the members choose.
Sick. All right, we'll wait and see how that shakes out. Let's chat about these big things, these policies that you're fighting on. Your first email to members in Victoria as leader was saying this: as leader, I'm working every day with our Green MPs to fight for the things we all need. Safe home, food on the table, a safe and healthy climate and environment. Yes, please. Our first priority in the coming weeks
is... Not too much to ask, is it, really?
Well, it seems pretty reasonable, but... as we've discussed at the start of this episode, the Greens are Hitler. I don't know if you've seen that opinion piece, but apparently that's where we're at now. Yes. Our first priority in the coming weeks is to push the Victorian Labor government to make unlimited rent increases illegal and to free up thousands of homes for renters and first home buyers by properly regulating Airbnb and short stays. So that was in April. Since then, we've had the budget from the Victorian Labor government that was handed down in May. How did they go when it came to housing justice? All thumbs down. We're going to get thumbs down for listeners of the podcast.
Not for renters. Not for housing justice.
Yes. Anything good, or what was the general Greens take on the
Labor's nothing response? Good. Yeah, nothing good if you need to have a roof over your head, which in fact, as it turns out, is all of us.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous, right? I mean, the Labor government just does not understand the level of pain that people are feeling in the community, particularly when it comes to housing and cost of things like groceries. They just don't get it. And they have no interest in actually solving the problems. And this is what I've learned ever since I have been a climate activist, in participating in actions to lock onto coal stations, right through when I was a policy advisor for a Labor premier in the public service on climate action, through to now. What I have seen over that entire time has been that Labor has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. That's what they are happy to do, and they have an interest in maintaining power rather than actually fixing some of these big issues. And I think housing is just the absolute epitome example of that, where they're happy to say a few nice things when they're pushed, but they don't actually want to fix the fundamentally cooked and broken housing systems that we have. And that's why we're not seeing any big shifts in terms of policy. We're seeing a few small things, but if you look at the history of housing policy in Victoria, they only do things when they're pushed by the Greens. And I know that people say, the Greens take credit for Labor's wins, but literally look at the examples. 2017, We were breathing down their necks in Northcote, about to win the Northcote by-election. And what did they do? Came out with a huge raft of rental reforms. So now you can have pets in your rentals. You can put hooks on the wall. You have to have a working toilet. Hurrah. And they literally only did that because we were about to win Northcote, right?
Yeah.
And then the other big reform that we've seen in the last year was an increased tax on vacant homes and vacant blocks of land. Why? Because we were in balance of power and we negotiated it. We actually put that policy on the table to them and they had to accept it or we wouldn't support their budget. So that's when you get change, and that's just what I see again and again, is that the only language that Labor seems to understand is brute political force, which is why we have to win more seats to exert that power.
What's the go with the 7.5% short stay levy that Labor's talking about? Again, for people outside of the state, or I don't even know the details of this really. But what is Labor Party saying? This is them taking on the scourge of Airbnb to do something about the housing crisis, and why does it fall short?
So on any given night in Victoria, there are 48,000 whole investment homes on Airbnb. 48,000. So if you just freed up a portion of those, it would make a huge dent in the housing crisis. Labor talks about needing more housing supply, right? Well, here's 48,000 homes that you could bring onto the market straight away. And yet Labor has really buried their head in the sand on this. I've been advocating for regulations to Airbnb since I was elected 10 years ago, and they haven't been interested. But now that the housing crisis is biting, they're realising that they need to do something. But all they've proposed is a 7.5% levy. So you're paying more for your Airbnb, but the analysis that we've seen shows that actually will do nothing to get those properties onto the rental market. And so we're saying we need to do what Sydney has just announced, what Brisbane has just announced, what dozens and dozens of cities around the world are doing, which is to put a cap on Airbnb. So you can't just buy a whole investment home and put it on Airbnb every single day of the year and make huge exorbitant profits while renters are sleeping on the streets.
So how does
we're still in negotiations on that.
Okay, so the levy as it's proposed, how does that work? The 7.5% of what? How does that work?
Of every booking. So essentially it's just a 7.5% on top of whatever you would pay to stay in an Airbnb passed on to the person who stays there. So technically they say it might be an incentive for people to put their properties on the rental market, but all the analysis I've seen shows that it's not at all, and that you need caps, and no other city is doing it like this. So I think what's happened is the Treasurer's just seen an opportunity to make a quick buck and a little bit of revenue because Victoria's in a bit of a dire financial position. And so they've gone, oh, look, there's some financial activity happening over there. Let's get a cut of that. I'd say that's the mafia's MO, right? That's not really good public policy.
Yeah. So, are they explicitly saying they're fine for that to be charged to the residents? There's nothing prohibiting that from just being passed on. That seems kind of like the wrong target, but okay.
Yeah.
Or the visitors, no residents.
They say that then the revenue would be spent on housing, but the revenue is such a tiny amount. It's like $70 million. And what would that buy you? $70 to $100 million. What would that get you? That would get you a couple of hundred social homes a year, whereas we're saying we could free up literally tens of thousands of homes if we regulated it properly.
And it's about 90 days is what the Greens are talking about, right? Like a 90-day cap on the amount of days per year that Airbnb owners could actually rent it out in short stay rental.
That's right. And so if you, it just gives an incentive, a financial incentive to say you can't buy a whole investment property and put it on Airbnb rather than putting it on the long-term rental market to have a renter live there full time. It fundamentally changes the financial incentive. And we're saying, look, Airbnb, the sharing economy could be a good thing if it's actually the sharing economy. So if you have a room in your house you want to rent out, you can still do that. If you don't want to stay in Melbourne for the Grand Prix, you want to go stay somewhere else and rent your room out while the Grand Prix is on, okay, go for your life. But you can't, or if you move interstate for a few months and then you come back, that's fine. But you can't just buy a whole apartment and then put it on Airbnb because you get more money than if you give it to a long-term renter. That's not okay.
I think it's so interesting because the Airbnb conversation is when the conversation of supply, as you say, if we unlocked all these Airbnb rentals into the long-term rental market, that would increase supply, which is what we're told everyone loves. It intersects with that versus private property rights, right? Like, hey, this is my investment property, or this is my other property. I should be able to do whatever hell I want so if I want to do a short stay accommodation and milk people, holiday makers, as much as possible to make a profit, I should be able to do that. You shouldn't have to force me and boss me around as to what to do with my extra little property there. It's an interesting little inflection point in the housing debate.
Totally. But this is the whole crux of the matter, right? Is that the treating housing like a commodity, like any other commodity in a private market, is just fundamentally cooked, because it's not the way that it works, and it skews everything, and that housing isn't some optional luxury. It's actually a fundamental human right, and everyone needs it to be healthy and survive. And therefore we cannot treat it like this free market commodity and just let everyone do whatever they want, because that's what got us to this situation.
Hell yeah. Another little proposal came through this week I thought was interesting. This is from the Marybeck Council. It was a proposal from James Conlon, who was a former Greens councillor. He did leave the party. But a bit of coverage on this. Landlords in the city's inner north could have their rates doubled, while owner-occupiers and local businesses get a 50% reduction under a contentious plan to address the housing crisis, to be debated by Melbourne Council this week. Marybeck Council is being asked by independent councillor James Conlon to investigate how it could introduce a new differential rate for residential property investors aimed at pushing them to sell, making more homes available to first-home buyers. So the whole idea is to, create a disincentive to make Marybeck less attractive to investors. And Conlon is saying it could slash rates for residents by around $900 a year, for every homeowner, and $2,700 for each local business. He put it out there, got a bit of coverage. The motion got support. So the council actually voted with the Green support on the council, voted in favour of the council preparing a report on the proposal. So the council goes away, looks into this, and comes back with a report in September for it to be actioned on. I don't know. What do we think about this? The idea of councils charging different rates depending on whether you own the home or you're a property investor. Do you think there's much in this?
I just think we need to look at every tool, right? Every tool that we have available. And the reason councils are looking at things like this is because they're desperate and they're seeing the housing need in their communities. And they're like, okay, well, what tools do we have available? They don't have nearly as many as the state and federal government, but they're trying everything they can. And there's other councils across Victoria who charge greater rates for, say, holiday homes than they do for people's residential owner-occupied properties. I think we just need to pull that all stop.
The first thing that I thought was that, this sounded almost similar to the proposal that the Greens brought to the Brisbane City Council elections around rent increases. So it's not exactly the same. It's not just in terms of whether you live in or use the home as an investment, but it was using rates to incentivize, I guess, particular investor or ownership action, and saying that if you increase the rent, then your rates would go up significantly. Right. And that was presented or interpreted as drawing a bit of a long bow and being like, well, you can't use rates in that way. That's ridiculous. So that's why I thought this was interesting.
Right. And just to be clear, again, the Greens saying, hey, unlimited rent increases, that should be against the law. That seems really bad. That's why people are getting kicked out of their houses. That's how people are getting rinsed left, right and centre, and why people are in housing stress. This was the big call from the Victorian Greens and the Greens across the country, and the Victorian Labor government says, no, we think they're cool and they're staying in place.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got, I think, some more rental reforms to come towards the end of the year, so they tell us, where we might be in balance of power on that. So we'll have to look at what we do around those. But our demands are the same that they've been for a little while, which is that unlimited rent increases should be illegal, and also ending no grounds evictions where you can just be kicked out at the end of your lease for no reason. And like I said before, I just think that Labor just fundamentally doesn't seem to get the level of pain that people are feeling in the community. The number of people that come up to me when I'm in the street, or even like staff in Parliament coming up to me and saying, how do I challenge my rent increase? I'm going to get kicked out. I don't know what to do. And we're the only ones talking about it, so they come to us for help. But it's just, the whole situation is completely untenable. And I think Labor is really going to rue the day that they ignored the housing crisis.
Let's move on to the fight for a free Palestine in Victoria. Of course, there's been lots going on that front. I guess I'd be interested in just specifically from a Victorian point of view. What does the fight for Palestine and, calling out the horrors of the war on Gaza look like from a Victorian point of view? Because there are specific relationships between the Victorian government or Victoria as a state and the Israeli war machine. Can you tell us a little bit about that, really, and the fight that you guys have been waging on that front?
Yeah, well, a few weeks ago, we actually had these extraordinary scenes in Victorian Parliament. A few things happened. So one is that after after in October last year, the Labor government explicitly moved a motion to say we stand with Israel as Israel was on the verge of invading Gaza. So we had that. Labor brought that motion into the Victorian Parliament to say we stand with Israel, and the Greens were the only ones to try and amend it and then to vote against it.
Mm.
And then in the last few weeks, we've had protesters come into the Parliament who were then ejected, and they closed the public galleries to members of the public walking in to watch our Parliament because of that. And then we had the Speaker of the Parliament determined that the keffiyeh, wearing the keffiyeh in Parliament, was a political symbol and therefore wasn't allowed, despite the fact that, let me say, there are members who wear little badges supporting the Israeli military, and they don't seem to be called out for that. And so we have all of these factors happening in the Victorian Parliament. But a few weeks ago, it converged on these quite extraordinary scenes, actually, because there was some community members who'd gone and collected petition signatures against the Victorian government's support for Israel. So let's remember, Israel, the Victorian government, the Labor government, has signed a secret MOU with the Israeli Ministry of Defence. Quite an unprecedented thing to do for a state government to sign an MOU with a foreign defence force. But the Victorian government has done that. No one really knows what's in it. Secondly, they've given material support, taxpayer dollars, to Elbit Systems, the Israeli weapons manufacturer. So community members were rightly outraged by this. They went and collected enough petition signatures to actually trigger a special debate in the Parliament. If you reach a certain threshold, you trigger a special debate. We brought on that debate, but the galleries were closed because of all this other action that had happened. And what ended up happening was these incredible scenes where you had a debate happening in the Victorian Parliament that no one could actually watch. And so hundreds of community members came to the steps. They set up a temporary screen and live streamed the debate onto the steps. We went out there to talk to them and to be with them. And there were literally hundreds of people spilling out onto Spring Street, watching this debate and engaging in our democracy in a way that I have never seen before. And Labor didn't even turn up for the debate in the end.
Jesus.
Wow.
And it was just, to me, it was this incredible example of how all the systems that Labor and the Liberals have built up to try and protect their power and keep the community out of our decision-making spaces just cannot hold anymore, because the community is so powerful and so strong and just saying, we're turning up regardless. You cannot lock us out of these people's spaces. And that was just an incredible thing to see.
What, did I read something about them rejecting the petition or something? What is that? What does
Yeah,
that
that's
mean?
right. So this is a community petition. And usually what happens with these petitions is a fairly new tool we have in Parliament. But if you get 2,000 paper, legitimate Victorian residents to sign on paper, then an MP can take that and bring a debate in Parliament. And we've done this a few times. And usually it's just a petition. It's just saying this is what a bunch of community members think, and there's no vote on it. It's just, okay, there's a petition in Parliament, there's a debate, but no vote. Labor forced a vote on it to vote against the community's petition. Never happened before. I've never ever seen that happen before.
That's really interesting.
What
Yeah,
does
that
it-
they
what does it
wouldn't
mean to say to reject what the petition was calling for, to end the relationship with Elbit, or was it, or to
Yes, and to end the MOU. Yeah, I know. What does it even mean to vote against? I don't believe this petition, like these community members get to have a voice. Like, is that what Labor are saying?
Incredible.
Because that's what it seemed like. And then they didn't even show up for the debate. So they didn't even get up to justify why they were voting against the petition. And it was farcical, because you had hundreds of people on the steps watching it and understanding exactly what was happening, and Labor trying to hide. And it just showed up the whole farce of the whole thing.
That's really interesting, because I don't even know if Labor governments in other jurisdictions would go out of their way to vote it like that. Like, I think that they would try to abstain or try not to raise the issue, like certainly in Queensland, whenever we've tried to get Queensland Labor to talk about Palestine and Israel, they just do everything they can to dodge it. But no, apparently Victorian Labor are like, yep, we want on record that we reject the community's view that we shouldn't be supporting the Israeli Defence Force.
It's actually quite remarkable. And the other thing is that often Labor uses this line against us, which is, you shouldn't be bringing an international issue that the Victorian Parliament can't have any influence over into the Victorian Parliament. remember what I said before, which was that we didn't bring it into the Victorian Parliament. Labor did by explicitly moving a motion as Israel was about to invade Gaza to say, we stand with Israel. They moved that motion. They're the ones who brought it into the Victorian Parliament, and we're just the ones standing with the community saying, we don't support that.
Yeah.
Well, you say you're standing with the community, Ellen, but I think you're throwing bricks and trashing and committing violence. And
You know who
encouraging
also
such
stood
things.
with the community?
Yes.
Hitler.
I mean, we talked about this on last week's episode with Campbell going from the Jewish Greens, and if people haven't listened to that, I encourage you to do so. It was great to chat to him about this, particularly as he was a former Greens candidate that everybody was talking about, and laid out the nonsense associated with the endorsement of violence that the Greens have been put out there. But last week, and I think this was published before we had a chance, or after our recording with Campbell, The Age ran this ridiculous piece by Chip Legrand, wreaking some destruction, the schism in the Greens driving out Jewish members. Activists rising to power in the Greens are intent on reshaping the party into a hard left force with overt sympathies for the pro-Palestinian protest movement, which is just like, first of all, it tells you everything you need to know. The idea that this is somehow damning that we have overt sympathies for a movement that is standing up for peace for the Palestinian people as they face a genocidal war. We just had a report this week from the UN talking about the war crimes that were committed, yes, by Hamas on October 7th, but of also the crimes against humanity that have been committed by the Israeli state since. The IDF, I think, has just been blacklisted by the UN. I mean, it's truly wild. But the article basically laid out the story of Daniel Coleman, who was a co-founder of the Jewish Greens, which sits within the Australian Victorian Greens. He left the party after October the 7th because of his concerns about anti-Semitism within the party, and also this article lays out the rise of radical activists within the party, and there's a lot of pearl clutching about such a thing. I mean, it is a really terrible piece for a whole bunch of reasons. They don't talk to current members of the Jewish Greens. They don't get interviews with other people from the party to discuss it. There's drawing a lot of long bows. Daniel Coleman is the only former Jewish member that's cited as leaving over these concerns. So I think driving out Jewish members seems to be a bit of a stretch. And they just
Jewish
uncritically
member,
report, repeating attacks on the party from everyone from Peter Khalil to anonymous sources. I guess I'd just be
Labor loves their anonymous sources for these articles.
Love an anonymous source,
especially in Victoria.
It's always very good and brave.
Hell.
What did you make of? I don't know if you read that piece, or what have you made of this particular discourse around the evil anti-Semitic Greens, Ellen?
Well, look, I think it's important with these pieces to remember where they're coming from. Firstly, coming from the 9 papers, I think we need to reframe them as the 9 papers.
Yes, right.
Most of the Age has been bought by 9.
9's good now. Peter Costello's gone. It's fine.
Oh, yeah, great. Everything's solved. Awesome.
Don't worry about it.
I think it's just important to know that Labor is trying to use every tactic to distract from what's actually going on, which is their support for Israel and their support for weapons manufacturers that are killing people, including children, in Gaza. And they're using every tactic because they're quite desperate, and they're seeing that they're not on the side of the community, and they're seeing how much angst there is in the community and how much people want them to push for peace, and they're not. And so they're using every tactic, including these kind of hit pieces on the Greens, and they think that they're onto a winner by talking about us in this frame. But I think that what they could do, if they actually were worried about this, is rip up their MOU with the Israeli Ministry of Defence. They could stop their support for weapons manufacturers, but it's easier for them, and it's more their MO, to seed attack pieces against the Greens. And I think it's just really important to know that that's what's going on here, is Labor trying to distract from their complicity in this whole situation.
Interesting. I mean, people pointed out the similarities between this piece and similar pieces we've seen in the past surrounding allegations of transphobia and this idea of stifling debate within the Victorian Greens particularly, and again, anonymous sources. It feels like there's discussion around the generational change and perhaps certain debates that are playing out in the Victorian Greens on certain issues around transgender rights and perhaps, the party's position or activism around Israel-Palestine.
I have seen some of this commentary that somehow we're no longer the party of Bob Brown anymore.
Yes.
And I guess I just remind people of that image of Bob Brown when George W. Bush came to the federal parliament, and it was the Iraq War, And Bob Brown stood up and got kicked out of the parliament for challenging him against the rules of the parliament.
Yes.
And we are a party of peace and nonviolence, right? That is literally one of our 4 pillars. No other party has such a strong basis. Our fundamental values, one of them is peace and nonviolence, and it is what we were founded on. We were founded on the anti-war movement. We were founded on the nuclear disarmament movement. And Bob got kicked out of parliament for challenging the Iraq war. We've had, throughout history, we've seen incredible young people, students leading these movements against apartheid in South Africa, for example, against the Vietnam War. Like those things, those movements would not have been successful if it wasn't for those brave students and young people standing up. And this is the same thing. This is young people putting their bodies and their voices on the line, often the only tools that they actually have available to them, to say, no, not in our name. This will not happen in our name. And I don't think that that's a break from the Greens of the past. I don't think it's a new direction for the Greens. I don't think it's somehow more or less radical than the way we've always been. We have always stood up for peace, and right from Bob Brown through to now.
Very well said. All right, we should wrap up pretty soon, but I guess the last thing to touch on is issues about climate destruction. Again, as we know that you came to politics through your climate activism, you're very passionate about that. I do note that the Victorian Labor government is pressing ahead with its very smart idea to drill for gas very close to the 12 Apostles, an absolute icon, a beautiful part of Victoria, very close to where I grew up. I've got a lot of fond memories of the 12 Apostles, and it's beloved by the Victorian community. I know this is a big campaign you've been working on for a long time as this project's been going through all the crazy approval process situation. For people outside of the state, can you just sort of give us a bit of idea about this project, where it's at, and whether anything can be done to stop it?
Well, if you've ever seen a tourism brochure about Victoria, it probably has the 12 Apostles on it. So it's pretty galling and amazing that you have the 12 Apostles on all the beautiful tourist propaganda for Victoria, and yet now the Labor Victorian government's decided it's cool, let's put a gas well there. Right next to the Marine National Park, let's drill for gas in our oceans right next to the 12 Apostles. I mean, just do they read science? Do they talk to climate scientists? We cannot have one more drop of fossil fuel burned if we are going to avert the worst impacts of climate catastrophe. And I came to politics because of climate change. I was an activist, taking action with people locking onto coal plants and blockading in the forest. We have known about this for a long time. We've known that we need to leave fossil fuels in the ground, and yet Labor has now approved a new gas drilling project right next to the 12 Apostles. So I actually just don't know what more to say about it than that surely it should be self-evident that you don't drill for gas next to a marine national park in a climate emergency. And that's not self-evident to the Labor Party. What are we even doing here?
So First Nations people have come out against the traditional owners. My understanding is that it's deeply unpopular in the local community, right? People don't really want this at all.
Absolutely. People don't want it. We've had a lot of engagement with traditional owners, in particular whale country dreaming custodians down there. It's an incredible area for marine wildlife. Local communities are really pissed off. We're really pissed off. Climate scientists are really pissed off. It's just outrageous to think that we could continue to drill for new gas. This is not even, we've got some existing infrastructure, it's hard to phase out. This is new gas drilling in a climate emergency. Just beyond belief.
So how close are they to actually beginning drilling? What approvals are left? Is there any actions that people can take to stop it from getting to that point?
So my understanding is this is pretty much the final approval. So they were exploring for gas, then they've got approvals for the pipelines and things, and this is the gas extraction approval, the final approval. There's some more projects to come, I guess is the thing to say, which is that there are over a dozen other coal and gas projects across Victoria, a lot off our coastline, that are still sitting on Labor's desk to approve. Both Commonwealth waters and state waters and onshore. So there's still over a dozen projects waiting for Labor's approval. And so there's plenty that people can do, which is really just join our campaigns, join the local community campaigns that are campaigning against fossil fuel extraction, because we're in a climate emergency.
Yeah.
Again, John Howard today. He's called for Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese to adopt a common purpose and agree for the Liberal and Labor parties to put the Greens last on their how to vote cards because of their divisive policies. Mr Howard told the Weekend Australian that if the Liberal and Labor Party joined forces to put the Greens last at the next election, they could reject an unacceptable element of Australian politics. The Greens are the real extremists of Australian politics. Now,
Thank you, Ellen Sandell. Thank you for doing everything that you're doing and for being the leader, and congratulations on that. Yes, we'll put your socials and let people know where they can go to help. Of course, we've got local council elections in Victoria later this year, and the federal election looms. And yes, people like Samantha Ratnam and other Greens candidates need your help to kick Labor MPs out to build green power.
Exactly. And we've got so many opportunities.
Cheeky plug for me. This is happening next weekend on the 22nd of June. That's a Saturday night at Beer Deluxe at Federation Square. I'm going to be telling jokes. Amazing lineup of comedians. We've got Geraldine Hickey, we've got Dave O'Neill, Claire Hooper. It's good times. That is happening next week, and I'll put a link in the show notes if one of people come along to that to raise cash for the local council campaign. You're coming out, you'll be there. Lucky you in.
Oh, it's so exciting. It's so exciting. We just have so many opportunities like across Victoria. I can't wait. I just to kick out both Labor and Liberal MPs because, like I said, I came from the climate movement, and I think we need incredibly strong movements to push politicians in the right direction, but we also need people who are just going to replace them.
Yes.
Replace the crap ones and get some good ones in there.
Yes. Here.
This is the one point where you don't recycle, where the Greens don't endorse recycling.
No. Single-use major party politicians.
They can go to a different use. They just shouldn't be making decisions about issues.
True. Yeah.
All right, thanks for your time this morning, Ellen. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Serious danger to Australia.